Okay, this video is in reply to a request from a guy called Kyle in the United States. Kyle's YouTube moniker is Grand Thumb 1941. He's a young guy out of the United States. He's already got a pretty impressive collection of service rifles, American, Japanese and Italian, as well as other bits and pieces, and he's asked about British service revolvers. He's looking to buy a service revolver and wanted some advice as to what would be the most desirable from a collector's point of view. That's a very difficult question to answer because I'm not aware of the variety of British service pistols that are available in the US. I suspect that there's quite a few of them, but whether one type is more prolific than another, I really don't know. They seem to be sort of in the $200, $300 range for the more common ones. But again, it's a hard question to answer. So what I'm going to do is take you through a range of the British service revolvers that were in use in the Second World War, talk about them, and you can make up your own mind as to which one is most appealing to you, or which might be the more desirable to acquire if you can find them. Alright, so we'll kick off with just a general discussion about British service revolvers. I did a video last year and I've deleted the bloody thing where I took them down to the range and fired them. There's half a video left. I'll try and post it, and that'll show you the .455 versus a .38 caliber, just an overview of how they look when they're fired. But the story of the British service revolver is an interesting one. The British Army of the day was inherently conservative. They gave a great deal of latitude to their officers to provide their own service revolvers. In the instruction handbook that was issued to young officers in the First World War, and basically carried on unchanged to the beginning of the Second World War, it stipulates that there are certain items of equipment that they were expected to provide for themselves. Things like their tailored uniform, their Sam Browne belt, their sword, and very often they have the option of bringing their own privately purchased revolver, provided that it would take the government issued ammunition. There was a great deal of latitude on the part of the establishment as to what officers armed themselves with. Going back even further, if you have a look at Winston Churchill when he was in the British Army in the Sudan and then latterly in South Africa, he armed himself with a C-96, a broom-handled Mauser, and nobody batted an eyelid. But overall, they were conservative and a bit suspicious of semi-automatic pistols. The ones that were around at the turn of the century and into the First World War were generally regarded with a bit of suspicion as to their reliability. So the Brits stuck with the old mechanically operated service revolver on the basis that it was never going to break and that it could be relied upon to fire and discharge reliably 99% of the time. This is what they went into with the First World War. It's the Webley Mark VI, this one produced in 1915. I'm including this in the World War II revolver series because a great many British officers were still armed with this particular revolver at the beginning of the Second World War, particularly officers in the Territorial Force and Reserve units. And that's especially true of the British Commonwealth, the New Zealanders, the Australians, the Canadians, although I'll talk to the Canadians. They had a slightly different option available to them, but a great many of the battalion commanders, senior officers at the outset of the Second World War were veterans of the First World War. They had their old service pistols to hand, and that's what they took to war with them. There were still a great many of these in Territorial Force armories, particularly here in New Zealand, for although we had followed the British as we did in adopting standard British firearms, and we had picked up the Enfield .38 pistol, they weren't available in sufficient numbers. So right throughout the early part of the Second World War you will see an incredible mishmash of different types of handguns in service with the British and British Commonwealth. The .455 was designed with really the British Empire in mind. It was a large caliber projectile, large caliber cartridge, and that was intended to be able to guarantee a disabling strike on one of the native peoples who was busy being colonised by the Brits. You have a look at the Zulus. They were pretty athletic guys, can move pretty quickly, and you needed something that was pretty substantial to drop one of those. If you have a look at the New Zealand Maori, they are big bastards. A 38 would probably bounce off them, so you needed a calibre that was large enough to guarantee a disabling hit with first round. It's precisely the same lesson that the Americans learnt in the Philippines against the Moro tribesmen. It's a very well-known tale that the 38 calibre pistols were inadequate, and that gave the impetus for the development of the 45 cartridge and subsequently the 1911, just a more potent man stopper. The cardinal virtue of the revolver, as I mentioned, is its simplicity and its reliability, as well as its robustness. The British elected for a top break system rather than a cylinder that swings out to the side, because they felt that this was more user-friendly for people on horseback, cavalry, mounted infantry. Easier to reload in the saddle with a system like this than a side cylinder. Also, at the time it was believed that that was a stronger design than a cylinder that could swing out and perhaps sustain damage. 455 was the calibre they went with, and these days it's available from Fiocchi. They manufacture it still, and so do Hornady, but it's reasonably expensive. The Fiocchi's not too bad, but the Hornady is pretty expensive. That's the cartridge there, big soft nosed projectile. I have also lucked out and managed to acquire a box of World War II manufacturer service 455 ammunition for the revolver, and that's the service cartridge. I'll just put them side by side so that you can see them there. You'll see that the service cartridge has a metal jacket. This was something that was introduced around the time of the First World War. Prior to that it was simply a lead slug, and the Hague Convention governing the use of munitions banned these soft nose because they had the characteristics of a dum-dum round. They would deliver a maiming wound, and the British, in order to conform with international treaty, then fully jacketed the cartridge, which made it a little less effective as a man stopper. So there we have it, the 455. It's a very robust firearm. It's quite easy to fire. It's reasonably soft, even given that it's quite a substantial cartridge, simply because of the mass of the gun. It tends to blot up a lot of the recoil. Very reliable and very iconic. And just a note on the lanyard. During the Second World War, the British learnt, particularly with the result of their experience up against the Japanese, that a lanyard placed around the neck made the user susceptible to being strangled with it. So you will see quite often officers have the lanyard displaced and just put under the epaulette of their shirt or their battle dress to avoid that possibility. And it sounds a bit extreme, but I have read an account of a British officer involved in hand-to-hand fighting with a Japanese officer who was trying to sabre him with his sword. He warded off the initial blow with his revolver, and it cut his trigger finger quite badly, and he gives a really appalling account of wrestling with the Japanese, one hand on the guy's sword and the other trying to get his finger into the trigger guard to shoot the Jap. But the slash on his finger acted like a fishhook, a barb, and it got stuck on the trigger guard. It took him some little time to get his finger off the trigger guard and on the trigger, and ultimately he was able to put the pistol in the back of the Japanese officer's neck and finish the affair. The Japanese were, certainly the Australians had this experience when they were conducting their fighting withdrawal back to Singapore. The Japanese captured British or Australian officers armed with this revolver and the old type of ammunition. They would execute them on the basis that it was a dum-dum bullet. So the Australians particularly learnt that if they were about to be taken prisoner by the Japs, their officers would tend to throw these things into the bush, get rid of them. Interesting story. Anyway, in the late 1930s, the British decided that they would transition to a smaller calibre. This calibre pistol delivers a roughly 245 foot-pounds per square inch of energy strike into the target. The 38 delivers only about 187 foot-pounds, so it's nowhere near as capable. However, the general rule is that it only requires about between 50 and 60 foot-pounds per square inch of energy transfer to disable a human target. So